With extracts from his own diary tapes, former Cabinet Minister Tony Benn recalls early predictions of the ideas which came to dominate politics during the 1980s.
For almost a generation after 1945, there was a loose political consensus in Britain, based on the work of Keynes and Beveridge and so on, around a shared commitment to full employment, to trade union rights, a welfare state, the maintenance of the National Health Service, and strong local government. But by the end of the 60s, a very different policy had begun to emerge, designed primarily to control inflation by squeezing wages, creating unemployment, and simultaneously freeing capital from any restraint. It was monetarism. By early 1976, the Labour cabinet itself had come to accept monetarism and to abandon the industrial policy on which it had been elected. This created tensions even among some left-wing cabinet ministers who used to meet at each other's homes on Sundays at what we called the husbands and wives dinners to discuss the situation. In January 1976, at one of those dinners, we had a fierce argument.
Sunday the 18th of January, Carol and I went to dinner with Michael and Jill Foote, also there Peter and Liz Shaw, and Catherine and Thomas Ballog. We talked at dinner about diaries. Michael and I are going to put in memoranda on it, though Michael isn't very much in favour of diaries coming out quickly. I told them about Sir Anthony Park's broadcast attacking me, and Michael said he'd take it up. Then we came upstairs, and after dinner we talked about the economic situation, where Michael and Peter had been to see Harold about reflation, accompanied by import controls, and Harold had been very tetchy, and they're seeing Dennis next week. But I'm not hopeful, because I attacked the complete abandonment of industrial policy, and I made the case for general import controls and investment-led reflation and industrial democracy, and Michael said that was completely unrealistic with the present cabinet. So I said, well, I think your plan is too. So he said, yes, but there's a better chance. Well, I said, I support you on that. Michael was very cross and said, it's unrealistic and inflation would have destroyed us. And Peter said, if you feel that, you should be leaving the government and trying to destroy it. And don't you recognize that there's been a big crisis since the manifesto was written? And they were both very angry. Well, anyway, I may have put it wrongly. I shouldn't have argued the case, but I feel with friends I must be able to argue the case that we are in danger of destroying the government. And Jill thought I should get out, or was probing to see if I was going to resign, and Peter thought I should get out and said, no, I'm going to be perfectly loyal, I said, to the government to try and make it succeed, but I think the present course will lead to our defeat. Well, that's the end of Sunday, the 18th of January, 1976.
The alternative economic strategy which I was advocating was, of course, rejected by the Labour cabinet, and I decided to try and find out what the Conservative Party in opposition was thinking, so as to understand their real strategy. Later that year, I invited William Rees-Mogg, the editor of The Times, to lunch with me in my office, and he was absolutely explicit in forecasting what Mrs. Thatcher would do if she came to power.
Tuesday, the 5th of October, 1976. At 1 o'clock, William Rees-Mogg came to lunch, the editor of The Times, and I had one of these executive lunches brought up from the canteen. And, of course, I've known William since 1946 or 7, when he came back from the army as Sergeant Rees-Mogg. I suppose he's about 3 or 4 years younger than me, must be 48. And he was then a very pompous young man with a gold watch and a rather fancy waistcoat. He'd been a sergeant in the army, and he's been editor of The Times for years now, and he writes all these great leaders warning about the freedom and the corporate state, and let's Bernard Levin savage me, and Lord Chalfont suggest I'm a com, and all that stuff. Well, we sat down immediately for lunch, and I offered him a drink. He had tonic water, and there he was in this big office with the 2 trade union banners, and he looked neither to right nor left. He didn't express any interest in the decoration or the big, beautifully carved pillar of coal or anything at all. And then I said to him, how do you see the political situation developing? Well, he said, I think that the government will go on for some time, perhaps for a couple of years. It will be more monetarist in its approach, but not sufficient to deal with the basic problems. Unemployment will stay roughly where it is. Inflation will not get below 10%. There will then be an election, and Mrs. Thatcher would get back. And then I said, well, what policy will she pursue? Well, he said, she believes, really, and so do I, in monetary stabilization. That is to say, that you would have a sudden attack on money supply. And this would lead to a temporary, substantial increase in unemployment, but then it would settle down, confidence would return, but it would be the way in which you brought people up to the shock and came back. And that is, I think, the right policy, because he said, I am a monetarist. Well, then we had a long discussion about Keynes and the collapse of the Beveridge idea and when the consensus died, and a very intelligent discussion, because, in fact, we both agreed about that the centre had really collapsed under us, and that there was now a pretty basic choice to be made. I said, I think your monetarist methods would be very disruptive. Why didn't he say the word disruptive, but would be very traumatic. And he is a revolutionary monetarist. And by God, if he tried to do it that way, there would be rioting, I think, just as he thinks that if he did it my way, there would be.
Let me make it absolutely clear that the next Conservative government will look forward to discussion and consultation with the trade union movement. As for confrontation, the confrontation that matters to us is confrontation with rising prices, with rising unemployment, with rising debts, and with the grave threat to Britain's future. So no one should allow the Labour Party to frighten them into thinking that there can be no domestic peace if we do what has to be done to save our economy. We're a party of ordinary people with ordinary hopes and beliefs, but with extraordinary qualities of tenacity and purpose.
Of course, in presenting this radical right-wing agenda, the then leader of the opposition made it sound immensely reasonable. But a few months later, in early 1977, I invited Peregrine Worsthorne of the Sunday Telegraph to come and see me. For him, it was the defeat of the trade unions and the dismantling of the welfare state that were the main Conservative objectives.
Thursday, the 10th of February, 1977. Peregrine Worsthorne came to lunch. He was very friendly. I think he's the political editor of the Sunday Telegraph. And I asked him about his writing, and he said he wrote on a Friday, and he was going to write about Marcia and Joe Haynes. Then I said to him, now look, can I put to you... Yes, the theory, I said, of the 40-year cycle, 1832, 1867, 1906, 1945, 1980. And the 40-year cycle theory is based on the idea that there have to be real reforms every so often. Well, he said, you see, yes, there will be real reforms, but there'll be radical right-wing reforms. Mrs. Thatcher will tear up the welfare state by its roots, tear up the health service, the education service by its roots. That's where the radicalism will come from. Well, I said... maybe you're right, you know, but it's going to be pretty disruptive in a way. So he said, well, she's prepared to deal with the unions as a power, but no social contract or wage control. She doesn't believe in all that. She'll just deal with them as a power in the land, but free collective bargaining. But of course, it'll all be controlled by monetary policy. So I said, well, if you think that'll really work, but you know, Heath tried it and he had to reverse. And I think she'll have to reverse it all too. So then he said, well, aren't you worried about the power of the unions? Well, I said, I know what you mean. The middle class is worried. But I said, if I look at the power I have to deal with, the unions are only a part of it. All right, Jack Jones is powerful, but it's nothing to what Fleet Street can do. Bernard Levin says you're mad. It makes you feel like poor old Solzhenitsyn in Russia. Only Bernard Levin can't actually put me in a lunatic asylum. I said, there's the power of the big oil companies come and sit here, great nation states, international, bigger than nation states. I said, there's the IMF. I said, in that jungle of wild power, I don't say the unions being dominant, they're important. Anyway, it was a very interesting discussion, and he's a highly civilized, courteous man. And I took him down to the door and shook hands with him, and he went off, and it's part of Francis Morel's veto lifting. He said in the end, it's a good thing that you're there to keep us on our toes or something.
So long before the Conservatives came to power in 1979, I knew exactly what to expect, and their forecasts turned out to have been precise and accurate. The main architect of monetarism was Sir Keith Joseph. And by chance, after they came to power, I met him on the last train from Bristol late one night, where each of us had been addressing public meetings.
Friday, the 20th of February 1981, I was dropped down at the station, and who should be on the station but Sir Keith Joseph, the Industry Minister. So we got into an empty first-class compartment, and we talked all the way back to London from 9:20 to about 11:15, 2 hours. Nobody else in the compartment, and it was great fun. And I said, at least we agree on this, Keith, that the last 35 years has been a disaster. And we talked about the Centre Party, and he said, what do you make of it? And I said, well, I've no time for them at all. Roy Jenkins is not interested very much. Shirley's very pessimistic. Bill Rogers is an organiser. David Owen was jumped up above his ability. And they all agree with David Seal and Ted Heath. And I think now we've got a reorganisation of politics on the basis of three parties representing monetarism, corporatism and democratic socialism. And he didn't disagree with the analysis. And I said, I just think that you will lead to a breakdown of the social fabric and that actually in 10 years' time our view will prevail, but we'll see. And anyway, he was saying the usual things about the trade unions don't represent their members properly, they shouldn't be political, there's too much over-manning. I said, you sound like Dennis Healy. And he said I was a romantic about the shop stewards, and I said he was a romantic about market forces. And he said, I said, when will you get back to full employment? Well, I don't know. And he didn't care about investment because of over-manning, and he didn't care about unemployment because he thought this was the right way of doing it. And there was an extraordinary shared analysis, except for the solution. He was very interested in industrial democracy and cooperatives and kept asking what it would mean and who would take the decisions and so on. And I said, well, I don't know, we must push it down the line. Your enterprise zone is my local enterprise board, and the entrepreneur is not the same as the owner of capital and so on. I told him about my plan for the small businesses and so on. And it was just fun. It was great fun. I liked him very much. I don't suppose I'll ever have, well, I haven't had a 2-hour talk like that with him for ages. And I said, why don't you have everything commercial defence, commercial universities, a coronation financed by Benson and Hedges. And he laughed, actually, because I think the idea of the further inroads into society by market forces appeals to him. He said, do you ever talk to Enoch? So I said, no. But he said, you know, Enoch was right in the sense that we shouldn't have had immigration without consulting people. Well, I said, if you're a believer in the free movement of capital, why not the free movement of labour? And I told him what Hoveyda, H-O-V-E-V-D-A, the executed Prime Minister of Iran, had said to me. Money, like people, should have a passport to move. And he hadn't quite thought of that. Anyway, what satisfied me, apart from being very friendly and non-provocative between us, and I've known him for 35 years, was that I felt in talking to him that I could knock him into a cocked hat in argument. I really felt that. And I said, we've got a competition between three ideas, and in the 1980s we shall decide. And he said, well, we have the disadvantage of being the front runners. Well, I said, we ran it recently. Oh, yes, but he said, people forget what you did. They haven't had time to forget about us. But then blow me down, he said, I'll take you home. So there was a brown Rover 3500 with a pool driver and 2 red boxes in it. So yeah, I popped in the front and he dropped me at Notting Hill Gate. People were amazed. Actually, the ticket collector looked a bit surprised, and a student coming by asked to shake my hand, and I said, that's Sir Keith Joseph, but he wouldn't shake hands with him. And as we walked off the train together, the engine driver leaned across and said, I wish I could get a picture of you two buggers for the newspapers. So anyway, Carol came in, and it's just after midnight, and that is the end of Friday, the 20th of February, 1981.
The rest is history, for we all saw in the 1980s what monetarism actually meant, and I suspect that that argument is far from over.